Hello, my friends. Welcome back. Today, I want to take you far beyond the headlines and into the dark engine room of this crisis, where NATO drones strike Russian civilian tankers in the Black Sea, where the CIA plays with terrorist groups like tools, and where the same empire that bleeds Ukraine is now tightening the noose around Venezuela. You're not going to see this on mainstream TV. You're not going to hear this from the usual experts who pretend the West is innocent and Russia's always the villain. In this video, we're going to connect the dots from the attack on Russia's shadow fleet to the pressure on Caracas, to the desperate moves of the United States that is losing its grip on global power while Russia and China rise. If you're ready to question everything you've been told about this war, about sanctions, about democracy and freedom, then stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see this conflict and the world behind it. NATO is attacking Russia yet again, and this time it is doing so in its traditional way, stabbing Russia in the back while pretending to be a defensive alliance. And this latest operation also ties directly into the pressure campaign against Venezuela. Ukrainian sources have proudly published images of Ukrainian and NATO drones striking the Russian tankers, Kairos and Virat, vessels linked to Russia's so-called shadow fleet in the Black Sea near Turkish waters. The ships were in Turkish waters, were seriously damaged, can no longer operate for now, but were not sunk, even though the Virat was reportedly hit twice. The crews were evacuated. The tankers were empty of fuel and oil because they were heading to the Russian port of Novorossiysk to load crude. And yet the NATO-Ukrainian operators openly broadcast their attack on civilian shipping as if it were some heroic act, publishing their own evidence of what are, in truth, acts of terrorism. These were civilian ships that did not feed Russian military infrastructure in any way, vessels intended to export Russian oil, not even formally owned by Russia, and not even flying the Russian flag, which is why they are described as shadow tankers. They served Russian interests, but not in a strictly legal or straightforward manner. That only underscores the reality. This was a deliberate strike on a civilian target associated with Russia, and the usual Western disinformation outlets will not highlight it. Then, when Russia responds in kind, those same outlets will cry and feign shock, pretending Ukraine is the innocent victim. I have no patience for that hypocrisy anymore, because we know perfectly well how NATO and Ukraine behave, and they will inevitably whine once the inevitable Russian retaliation comes. The disinformation media will spend the day lamenting that Russia struck Kyiv, describing Moscow as evil, while staying silent about this drone attack the day before. Fortunately, the crews were saved and the tankers were empty, which prevented a serious environmental catastrophe. But even so, these actions by NATO and Ukraine are extremely dangerous, and no one can seriously deny that these operations are carried out by NATO under a Ukrainian flag of convenience. This is a typical NATO operation. Ukraine does not and cannot conduct these actions alone. These surface and aerial drones did not even necessarily depart from Ukrainian territory. They may have launched from Romania, from Turkey itself, or from other NATO-controlled platforms. You cannot trust the Turkish leadership, the Ukrainian leadership, the Romanians, or any of the NATO crowd in this. It is a NATO strike, while Ukraine is used as the scapegoat, just as Israel is used, just as the Venezuelan opposition is used, just as the more radical Taiwanese separatists are used, just as any proxy is used in this system. Ukraine simply does not have the technical capabilities, intelligence integration, satellite support, or networked C2 infrastructure to plan and execute such an operation by itself. You need satellites, you need Western-made drones, in this case, British systems, trained operators, signal relays, communications infrastructure, and the full ISR picture that Ukraine simply does not own. The satellite constellation, the data links, the live imaging feeds, this is Starlink, NATO, and U.S. infrastructure. I have said many times that these and other attacks on Russia are NATO operations conducted under a Ukrainian umbrella, and time has proven that assessment correct, with multiple Western media pieces in outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post acknowledging that these attacks are coordinated with NATO. This operation against the tankers is the same pattern we saw with strikes against Russian strategic air bases. NATO assets are involved, Western intelligence services, including the CIA, are involved, and the attack is timed precisely when negotiations are being discussed. Next week, Russian officials are supposed to meet with Western representatives in Moscow and elsewhere, and yet at this crucial moment, NATO chooses to stab Russia from behind in a treacherous way, undermining any basis for trust. How can anyone seriously claim that Washington can control NATO or restrain its own deep state when, at the very moment it talks about peace in Ukraine, it continues these covert escalations? Trump, for example, can say he wants peace. He can say he wants to stop the slaughter in Ukraine and project himself as a peacemaker in public statements. But if he has no real control over NATO's war machine, over the intelligence services, over the entrenched bureaucracies, then what is the value of his promises? If NATO continues to act as before or even more aggressively, his rhetoric is worthless. We are on the threshold of supposedly crucial negotiations talks in Washington, then early next week in Moscow or possibly Miami. And yet, once again, NATO behaves as it always has, with the CIA and allied services orchestrating operations in the shadows. I have long warned that behind terror-style attacks in various theaters, you find the same Western services, and we are now seeing public admissions from people who actually helped organize these crimes, proving that the so-called terrorists are often just proxies and vassals for Western intelligence. Russian experts like Win-Win have underlined that the terrorist attacks on the tankers in Turkish waters were coordinated by British naval intelligence and likely managed from Romania and Turkey. Analysts like him often soften their criticism of Washington because they still hold some illusions about Trump or the United States, but the reality is that behind this are U.S. agencies like the CIA using advanced technology and platforms that go beyond even the British or other NATO members' systems. The reconnaissance aircraft constantly skirting Russia's borders, the drones launched from Sicily or Germany that spend hours mapping Russian air defenses and frontline positions are American. Poseidon aircraft, reconnaissance planes, tanker aircraft, Global Hawk drones, these are U.S. assets. Washington knows exactly what is happening because it is its own ISR platforms that identify the targets and probe Russian vulnerabilities before Ukrainian and NATO drones strike. How can Moscow trust any overture from Washington when, at the very same time, American aircraft and drones are combing Russia's borders, probing for weak points and feeding targeting data into Ukraine's operations? I want peace more than most, but the behavior of NATO and U.S. elites is pushing the situation far beyond what can be tolerated. You cannot lower your guard with such actors. They rely on relentless pressure, psychological warfare, and constant testing of red lines. There are those who accuse analysts like me of being too kind-hearted, too optimistic, or too naive. But there is a big difference between wanting peace and being blind. I make no apology for being fundamentally decent or for advocating peace on camera, because anyone who speaks to a large audience has a moral obligation to defend peace over war, regardless of whether they are in Beijing, Madrid, or Miami. You cannot responsibly sit in front of a camera and cheer for war and escalation. That does not mean, however, that we should be foolish. In private, I might tell you that harsher measures should be considered against the Ukrainian regime and its backers, but publicly I will not call for invasions or genocidal campaigns the way some right-wing extremists openly call for assaults on Venezuela or other sovereign states. Being a decent person does not equate to being weak or oblivious to defense imperatives. Some people confuse moral integrity with strategic incompetence, but that is nonsense. There are intelligent and principled people, and there are ruthless fools. Personally, I prefer to remain principled and clear-eyed at the same time. Trump, for his part, has recently demanded that all airlines, pilots, smugglers, and traffickers treat Venezuelan airspace as completely closed, issuing a message that many have interpreted as a prelude to some imminent attack. In my view, his directive is more of a pressure tool, a form of psychological and economic warfare against the Venezuelan government, rather than a direct announcement of an immediate strike, although it could, of course, be connected to future military actions. The U.S. aviation authorities have already declared Venezuelan airspace dangerous, and Washington has issued notices to airmen to that effect. Trump's public statement on social media is another way of tightening the screws on Venezuela, imposing flight cancellations, forcing Venezuelans in Spain and elsewhere to reroute through countries like Colombia, and turning everyday travel into a logistical nightmare. This is psychological warfare and harassment, a crude form of pressure which Venezuelans must learn to endure, because we do not know how long this tantrum from Washington will last. The United States is financially strained, the empire is overstretched, and in that desperation, it looks for targets it deems weaker, close at hand, rich in resources, and riddled with a comprador opposition willing to act against its own nation. Venezuela fits that profile, and so it becomes the focus of this imperial frustration. Washington tried and failed in Iran, it has failed in Ukraine, it will fail in the Asia Pacific, and so it sees Latin America, Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Honduras as the next terrain to destabilize. Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin has argued that Trump wants to close the Ukrainian front and pivot toward Latin America, and in this he is essentially correct, although it is hardly a bold revelation now that U.S. warships sit in the Caribbean with guns trained on the region. The problem with Dugin and others like him is that they sometimes present themselves as profound strategic geniuses while wearing symbols of American political factions that have wreaked havoc around the world. It is hard to take seriously anyone who praises Trump or his Make America Great Again movement while simultaneously acknowledging that U.S. intelligence, political elites, and military structures have been undermining sovereignty in Eastern Europe and Latin America. There are more reliable analysts, such as Anatoly Wasserman and others from Odessa and across the Russian world, who have been far more precise in their assessments, even though they receive less publicity than Dugin. What matters here is not the aura of some Western-style geopolitical guru, but the hard reality. U.S. intelligence is giving targeting information to Ukraine to kill Russians. Washington and the CIA deliberately triggered the war in Ukraine, and yet some commentators still wear American political symbols as if nothing had happened. The same pattern appears in Central America, where Trump has openly called on Hondurans to vote for a right-wing candidate like Tito Asfura, even going so far as to pardon Juan Orlando Hernandez, a former Honduran president imprisoned in the United States on narco-trafficking charges, in a transparent effort to curry favor with Honduran voters and manipulate their elections. This is a blatant interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state, and if President Vladimir Putin did anything remotely similar, publicly endorsing a candidate in some Western election, the Western media would explode with outrage, painting him as a dictator with a long reach and an enemy of democracy. Yet when Trump interferes in Honduran politics, the mainstream shrugs and laughs it off as just another eccentric move. The hypocrisy could not be clearer. Washington pretends to care deeply about fighting narco-trafficking and uses that pretext to justify its aggressive posture towards Venezuela, accusing the so-called cartel of the Suns and demonizing Caracas. Yet when it suits their geopolitical agenda, U.S. authorities release or pardon figures they themselves labeled as drug traffickers. Their narrative collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has correctly pointed out that Trump's open endorsement of a Honduran presidential candidate constitutes a flagrant interference in Honduras's electoral process and its internal affairs. When the United States chooses a candidate, you can be sure that this choice is designed to benefit the empire, multinational corporations, and financial giants like BlackRock, not the people of that country. Figures like Esfera or other right-wing darlings in Latin America are good only in the sense that they serve U.S. interests. They are disastrous for their own nations. At the same time, Venezuela is reaffirming its unwavering support for the Palestinian cause, especially on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, declared by the United Nations on the 29th of November 1977. Venezuelan leaders rightly emphasize that supporting Palestine's struggle for freedom, statehood, and the right to live on its historical land is supporting a fundamentally human cause. Palestine has a defined territory, a people, a government, a distinct historical identity. And yet, its basic rights are trampled while Israel, acting as a regional enforcer for U.S. interests, conducts operations across the Middle East with extraordinary impunity. Venezuela has called on international courts and organizations to prosecute Israel for war crimes in the region, not just in Gaza, but also in its actions against multiple peoples: Yemenis, Syrians, Lebanese, Iranians, Iraqis, and even Egyptians have suffered from Israeli and U.S. operations, either directly or indirectly. In the Middle East, Israel functions as a rabid attack dog for Washington, seemingly entitled to strike anyone at any time with minimal accountability, while the United States tries to hide behind its proxies, be they Israel, Ukraine, or any other willing client. In Latin America, however, there is no Israeli buffer. If Venezuelans die under bombardment, it will be from American weapons and decisions. The Venezuelan opposition is too fragmented and corrupt to act as an effective proxy force. They cannot even agree on how to divide the money they receive from foreign sponsors, never mind coordinating a serious coup or counter-revolution. If there had been a coherent mercenary force or a disciplined proxy army ready to storm Venezuela on Washington's orders, the region would already be in open war. Fortunately, many of the mercenaries drawn from Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela, and elsewhere have already been ground down and neutralized on the battlefields of Ukraine, serving as cannon fodder in NATO's failed attempt to strategically defeat Russia. Those mercenaries, who might otherwise have been used later in Latin America, are now feeding the soil in regions of Ukraine and Russia liberated by Russian forces. This is one of the many unintended consequences of Washington's overreach. Russia has faced an unprecedented onslaught of mercenary forces from the Middle East, Latin America, Central Asia, and Africa, all coordinated by NATO intelligence, the CIA, MI6, Mossad, BND, and others, with the goal of breaking Russian resistance and shattering its state. Yet despite this coalition, Russia has not only endured, but turned the tables. Some Western commentators try to present Russia as bogged down or fixed in Ukraine, unable to engage elsewhere. This is a complete inversion of reality. It is NATO that has become strategically stuck in Ukraine, having poured resources, credibility, and political capital into a campaign that has failed to defeat Russia. While Moscow has gained invaluable combat experience, tested and improved its weapon systems, and proven its ability to withstand the combined pressure of the West. You cannot corner a bear. The hunters who try often discover too late that they are the prey. The Russian people have demonstrated a rare unity of purpose, supported by a capable leadership and an immense resource base, and have outmaneuvered an alliance that believed itself unbeatable. This has had direct repercussions on other theaters. Israel finds it harder to escalate in the Middle East with NATO already overstretched. The remnants of ISIS and other extremist groups are weaker, and U.S. attempts to shift pressure toward Iran via proxy forces face serious limitations. Even within Western institutions, we see cracks. For example, reports from Washington Post about senior U.S. officials giving illegal orders, effectively calling for the indiscriminate killing of targeted individuals, were loudly denounced as fake news by those same officials, only for them to turn around and publish statements essentially confirming the aggressive intent behind those alleged orders. This incoherence, this inability to maintain a consistent narrative, reveals not only moral failure, but strategic confusion. On the other side, China has taken a clear stance in defense of Venezuela's sovereignty, calling for the removal of unilateral sanctions that have no basis in international law and have not been authorized by the UN Security Council. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning has stressed that Beijing opposes such arbitrary measures and any interference in Venezuela's internal affairs under any pretext, including accusations about criminal organizations like the so-called Cartel of the Suns. Even if Washington's claims about such cartels were entirely true, which they are not, they would still provide no legal basis for attacking a sovereign state. A country has the right to defend its own borders against drug trafficking, to deploy forces, and to enforce its laws on its own territory. But it does not have the right, under international law, to invade or bomb another country under that pretext. In practice, however, international law is subordinate to power and U.S. interests, which is why Venezuela and other independent states must rely on alliances with Russia, China, Iran, and others to resist this pressure. Mao Ning's call for peace, stability, and development in Latin America and the Caribbean is morally correct, but it is also somewhat naive in the sense that the United States has historically sought precisely the opposite: division, conflict, and dependency in the region, so that Washington can loot resources and dominate markets while local elites fight one another. The rational response from China is not only diplomatic appeals, but also concrete preparation, economic, political, and military, to ensure that any U.S. attempt to replicate in Latin America what it has done elsewhere can be countered. Taiwan is a key factor in this equation. U.S. leaders know that any reckless move against Venezuela or other Latin states increases the risk that China will advance decisively on Taiwan with the same preemptive security logic the United States claims for itself. Washington also fears the potential costs of a failed operation, yet it finds itself in such a desperate strategic situation that it oscillates between paralysis and impulsive aggression. These are times the United States never expected to live through: the erosion of its hegemony, the emergence of powerful rivals, and a technological gap that is widening in some fields rather than narrowing. China has surged ahead in many areas. Look at the latest smartphones from Huawei or Xiaomi compared to Apple's iPhones. 5 or even 3 years ago, Chinese phones were seen in the West as cheap plastic imitations. Now they surpass Apple's devices in multiple metrics, despite U.S. attempts to cripple Chinese tech through restrictions on chips and services. Chinese firms have innovated at a pace that Western companies, especially American ones, have struggled to match. U.S. technology in some sectors looks static, while Chinese products iterate rapidly each year, eclipsing the last generation. The same is true across a range of technologies, and Venezuela's alignment with China places it on the side of rising power rather than declining hegemony. To surrender now out of fear of U.S. economic and psychological warfare would not just be a mistake, it would be a crime against Venezuela's future, particularly when there is a clear alternative bloc anchored by Russia and China that has shown the ability to withstand and even reverse Western attempts at domination. I have said before, and I repeat, in a few years you will see more modern cars in Caracas than in Miami, and that symbolizes the broader shift underway. The empire has entered a period of decay. Its political class is divided. Its economy is burdened, and its technological edge is being eroded. In this context, Russia's resilience in Ukraine and China's advances in industry and technology have opened space for countries like Venezuela to resist and even thrive, provided they remain firm, deepen their alliances, and refuse to capitulate. The CIA's own admissions, like those from Susan Miller in Tel Aviv, who spoke candidly about the agency's cooperation with ISIS and al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria to destabilize regimes deemed hostile to U.S. interests, confirm what many of us have been warning about for years. These so-called terrorist groups have long been manipulated and used as tools by Western intelligence agencies. In the Middle East, the only force that truly fought these extremist organizations seriously and consistently has been Iran and its allied resistance forces, which is precisely why Iran is relentlessly demonized as the bad actor by Washington and its media echo chamber. Whenever a state insists on genuine sovereignty and refuses to serve U.S. strategic and economic interests. It is branded a dictatorship or a rogue regime, no matter how many democratic procedures it has or how legitimate its security concerns might be. The pattern is the same whether we are talking about Iran, Venezuela, Russia, or other independent actors. Western commentators who still cling to the illusion that the CIA and similar agencies protect democracy are either uninformed or complicit, because the historical record from the creation and weaponization of extremist groups after the invasion of Iraq to the series of coups and color revolutions across Latin America and Eastern Europe shows that U.S. policy is driven by power and resource extraction, not by human rights or the rule of law. That is why there can be no real peace while the United States behaves as it does now. Either Washington's imperial posture collapses from within, or the world will be forced to endure periodic crises and wars until a new balance of power is fully consolidated. Russia's role in this emerging balance is central. By absorbing and reversing NATO's onslaught in Ukraine, Moscow has exposed the limitations of Western power, bought time and space for its partners, and demonstrated that the old imperial system is neither omnipotent nor invulnerable. For Venezuela, Palestine, Iran, and many others, this is not an abstract geopolitical game. It is a matter of survival and dignity. And for anyone who still believes the Western narrative, who still thinks that the United States and its allies are the natural defenders of freedom, one only has to look at their alliances with extremists, their meddling in elections, their economic strangulation campaigns, and their open contempt for international law. The mask has slipped, and under it we see the same old empire, but weaker, more erratic, and therefore more dangerous.